There is a silent shift happening inside your mind, and most people never notice it until it's too late. You wake up, reach for your phone almost automatically, and within seconds your attention is pulled into a world that was not created by you, but carefully designed to capture you. Images move fast, information appears without effort, and your brain responds instantly. You don't think about it. You don't question it. You simply engage. At first, it feels normal. But over time, something begins to change. You start noticing that it's harder to stay focused. Tasks that once felt simple now feel heavy. You begin things, but your attention drifts. You tell yourself you need more discipline, more structure, more motivation. But what if none of that is actually the problem? What if the real issue is that your brain has been trained, day after day, to expect a level of stimulation that real life cannot provide? Because this is where everything begins. Your brain is not designed for constant intensity. It is designed for contrast. Effort followed by reward. Silence followed by action. Focus followed by rest. But in the modern environment, that balance no longer exists. Instead, your brain is exposed to continuous stimulation. Short videos, endless scrolling, notifications, rapid changes in content. Each one delivers a small signal, a brief sense of anticipation, a micro-reward that requires no effort. And slowly, without any visible warning, your system adapts. Not emotionally. Biologically. The threshold for stimulation increases. What used to be enough is no longer enough. What used to hold your attention now feels slow, almost unbearable. This is why reading feels difficult. This is why working deeply feels exhausting. This is why you search for distraction even when you don't want to. Because your brain is no longer calibrated for stillness. It is calibrated for speed. And the more you feed it speed, the less it tolerates anything else. This is not weakness. This is conditioning. A pattern that has been repeated so many times that it now feels like part of your identity. You begin to believe that you are someone who can't focus. Someone who struggles with consistency. Someone who lacks discipline. But that belief is built on a misunderstanding. Because what you are experiencing is not who you are. It is what your environment has trained you to become. And once you see that clearly, something important shifts. You stop blaming yourself. And you start observing the system. You begin to notice how often your attention is pulled away without your permission. How quickly your mind seeks stimulation the moment it encounters discomfort. How silence, something that should feel natural, now feels unfamiliar. And this is where awareness becomes powerful. Because the moment you recognize the pattern, you create a distance between you and it. You are no longer fully inside the loop. You are watching it. And when you can watch something, you can change it. But change does not come from force. It does not come from trying to be more disciplined overnight. It comes from understanding what your brain needs in order to function the way it was designed to. Your brain needs space. It needs moments where nothing is happening. Moments where it is not being stimulated, not being entertained, not being pulled in different directions. At first, this feels uncomfortable. Almost unnatural. You may notice a subtle tension, a restlessness, an urge to reach for something, your phone, a screen, any form of distraction. This is not failure. This is the absence of stimulation that your brain has become dependent on. And if you stay in that space, without escaping it, something begins to happen. Your system starts to regulate. Slowly. Quietly. Your thoughts become more coherent. Your attention, though still fragile, begins to stabilize. Tasks that felt impossible start to feel manageable again. Not because they changed, but because you did. Because your brain is returning to a baseline that allows it to engage with reality instead of constantly escaping it. And this process cannot be rushed. It requires consistency, not intensity. Small shifts, repeated daily, create the conditions for deeper transformation. You begin with simple boundaries. You delay the first moment of stimulation in your day. You give your mind time to wake up without external input. You reduce the noise that fills every empty space. And in that quiet, something rare appears. Clarity. Not a dramatic breakthrough, but a subtle sense that you are thinking more clearly, reacting less impulsively, choosing more consciously. This is the beginning of control. Not control over everything, but control over the one thing that shapes everything else. Your attention. Because where your attention goes, your life follows. Every decision, every habit, every result is influenced by what you focus on repeatedly. And if your attention is constantly fragmented, your life becomes fragmented as well. But if your attention becomes stable, directed, intentional, your life begins to align in the same way. You don't need to escape the modern world. You don't need to eliminate technology. You need to change your relationship with it. To move from unconscious consumption to conscious use. From reaction to intention. From overload to balance. And once that shift happens, you start to experience something that many people have forgotten is even possible. Sustained focus. Deep engagement. A sense of presence that is not interrupted every few seconds. And in that state, work becomes easier. Decisions become clearer. And most importantly, you begin to trust yourself again. Not because you forced discipline, but because you removed what was interfering with it. This is not a quick fix. It is a recalibration. A return to a natural state that has been buried under layers of constant stimulation. And the process is simple but not easy. You create space. You reduce noise. You allow your mind to experience stillness again. And over time, that stillness becomes strength. Because in a world that is constantly competing for your attention, the ability to direct it consciously is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. And once you have it, everything else becomes possible. And the moment you begin to regain control over your attention, you start to notice something even deeper. It's not just your focus that has changed. It's the way you experience reality itself. Because for a long time, you weren't actually living your life in a direct way. You were reacting to fragments of it. Short inputs. Quick impressions. Incomplete thoughts. Your mind was constantly moving but rarely settling. And when a mind never settles, it never fully processes. This is why so many people feel overwhelmed, even when nothing significant is happening. Their brain is not tired from effort. It is tired from fragmentation. From switching between stimuli so quickly that no single experience is ever fully completed. And over time, this creates a subtle but powerful effect. You lose depth. Conversations feel shallow. Ideas feel incomplete. Emotions feel either too intense or strangely distant. Because depth requires time. And time requires attention. Without attention, everything becomes surface level. And when everything is surface level, nothing feels meaningful. This is one of the hidden consequences of overstimulation. Not just distraction, but disconnection. Disconnection from your thoughts, from your environment, from yourself. And this is where the real work begins. Not in forcing yourself to focus, but in learning how to stay. To stay with a thought long enough to understand it. To stay with a task long enough to complete it. To stay with a moment without needing to escape it. At first, this feels uncomfortable. Because your system is not used to stillness. It is used to movement. So when you slow down, your mind speeds up. You may notice more thoughts than usual. More internal noise. More restlessness. This is not regression. This is exposure. You are finally seeing what has always been there, but was previously covered by constant input. And if you remain in that space, without immediately trying to fix it or escape it, something begins to reorganize. Your thoughts start to form patterns. Your attention begins to anchor itself. And slowly, your internal world becomes more structured. This is the beginning of mental clarity. Not something you chase. Something that emerges when interference is removed. And with clarity comes another shift. You begin to see your behaviors more objectively. You notice when you reach for your phone without intention. You notice when you avoid discomfort. You notice when your focus breaks and why. This awareness is not meant to judge you. It is meant to give you leverage. Because once you understand the mechanism, you are no longer controlled by it. You have a choice. And choice creates space. Space between impulse and action. Space between distraction and decision. And inside that space, you begin to rebuild control. Not through force, but through alignment. You start to structure your environment in a way that supports focus instead of constantly interrupting it. You remove unnecessary triggers. You simplify inputs. You design your day with intention, not reaction. And something subtle but powerful begins to happen. You stop needing constant stimulation. You stop craving distraction every few minutes. You begin to tolerate and eventually appreciate moments of stillness. Because stillness is where integration happens. It is where your mind connects ideas. Where your emotions settle. Where your nervous system resets. And without these moments, your system remains in a constant state of low-level stress. Always active. Never complete. This is why many people feel tired even when they haven't done anything physically demanding. Because mental overload is not about effort. It is about accumulation. Too many inputs. Too many signals. Too little processing. And when you begin to reduce that load, your energy starts to return. Not in sudden bursts, but in steady, reliable levels. You feel more stable, more grounded, less reactive. And from that state, your actions begin to change naturally. You don't force yourself to work. You simply start. You don't fight distractions. You notice them and return. You don't rely on motivation. You rely on structure. And structure, over time, becomes identity. Not the identity you tried to force in the past, but one that emerges from consistent alignment between your actions and your environment. This is how real change happens. Not through intensity, but through repetition. Not through pressure, but through clarity. And the more you practice this, the more you realize that focus is not something you achieve. It is something you allow. By removing what disrupts it. By respecting the limits of your attention. By understanding that your brain is not designed to handle everything at once. It is designed to engage deeply with one thing at a time. And when you give it that opportunity, it performs differently. More efficiently. More creatively. More sustainably. And this is where your relationship with effort changes. What once felt exhausting begins to feel manageable. What once required willpower becomes automatic. Not because the work became easier, but because resistance decreased. And as resistance decreases, consistency increases. And consistency, over time, creates results that feel almost effortless. But they are not effortless. They are the product of a system that supports the way your mind actually works. This is the difference between forcing change and designing it. Forcing is temporary. Design is sustainable. And when your environment, your habits, and your attention begin to align, something powerful happens. You stop fighting yourself. And when you stop fighting yourself, progress becomes natural. Not perfect, but steady. And steady is enough. Because in a world that constantly pulls you in different directions, the ability to stay with one thing, fully, calmly, intentionally, is rare. And anything that is rare, when practiced consistently, becomes valuable. Not just externally, but internally. You begin to trust your ability to focus, to complete, to follow through. And that trust is the foundation of everything else. Because once you trust yourself, you no longer depend on external stimulation to move forward. You move because you choose to. And that is where real control begins. Not in what you consume, but in what you allow to shape you. At a certain point, this is no longer about productivity. It becomes a question of control. Because the moment you understand how attention works, you realize something uncomfortable. Most of your behavior is not chosen. It is triggered. You don't decide to check your phone. You react to an internal signal. A micro discomfort. A slight drop in stimulation. A moment of uncertainty. And your system moves automatically to eliminate it. This is the foundation of modern conditioning. Not force. Not control in the traditional sense. But frictionless influence. Your environment is structured in a way that removes effort from the act of distraction, while increasing effort for the act of focus. And the human brain always moves toward the path of least resistance. This is not weakness. This is efficiency. But efficiency, when directed incorrectly, becomes self-sabotage. Because what is easy is not always what is useful. And what is useful is rarely immediate. This creates a fundamental conflict inside your system. Your biology seeks efficiency. Your long-term goals require effort. And without awareness, biology wins every time. This is why most attempts at discipline fail. They try to override a system without understanding it. They rely on force against a mechanism that is designed to conserve energy. That is not sustainable. What works is not force. What works is alignment. You do not fight your brain. You structure your environment so that the desired behavior becomes the easiest option. You reduce the accessibility of distraction. You increase the accessibility of focus. This is not motivational. This is architectural. And once you see behavior as architecture, not morality, everything changes. You stop asking, "Why am I like this?" And you start asking, "What system is producing this result?" Because behavior is not random. It is the output of conditions. Change the conditions and the output changes. Not instantly, but inevitably. This is where most people misunderstand control. They think control means resisting impulses. In reality, control means designing a life where impulses work in your favor. Where the default action moves you forward, not backward. And that requires one thing above all: clarity about what matters. Because without clarity, your attention becomes available to anything. And anything will take it. The modern environment does not need to force you. It only needs to offer enough stimulation to keep you occupied. And if your internal direction is weak, external inputs will define your path. This is why attention is not just a cognitive function. It is a strategic resource. It determines what you notice, what you repeat, what you reinforce. And over time, repetition becomes identity. Not because you decided it, but because you practiced it. If you repeatedly engage with distraction, you become someone who is easily distracted. If you repeatedly engage with focus, you become someone who can focus. There is no abstraction here. Identity is built through repetition under specific conditions. Which means identity is not fixed. It is conditioned. And conditioning can be changed. But only through consistent exposure to different patterns. Not ideas. Not intentions. Patterns. This is where discipline is often misunderstood. Discipline is not intensity. It is stability. The ability to execute the same behavior under varying internal states. Whether you feel like it or not becomes irrelevant. Because the system does not depend on feeling. It depends on structure. And structure reduces decision-making, which reduces cognitive load, which increases consistency. This is not motivational language. This is operational design. You remove unnecessary choices. You define clear boundaries. You create predictable patterns. And over time, those patterns require less effort to maintain. Because they become automatic. Not perfectly, but reliably. And reliability is what creates results. Not occasional intensity, but sustained direction. Now, at a deeper level, this connects to something more fundamental. Your perception of time. When your attention is fragmented, time feels compressed. Days pass quickly but without depth. You experience more inputs but less meaning. Because meaning requires integration. And integration requires time spent on a single experience. When you restore attention, time changes. Moments feel longer. Experiences feel more complete. Your sense of presence increases. This is not subjective illusion. It is a function of how your brain processes information. More focus, deeper encoding, stronger memory, richer experience. This is why a focused life feels fuller, even if externally it looks simpler. Because depth replaces volume. And depth creates satisfaction. Not the artificial satisfaction of stimulation, but the stable satisfaction of completion. And completion is what builds confidence. Not thinking about doing something. Not planning. But finishing. Closing loops. Executing fully. This is where attention becomes power. Because without attention, nothing is completed. And without completion, nothing accumulates. And without accumulation, nothing changes. So the question is no longer, how do I become more motivated? The real question is, how do I structure my attention so that progress becomes inevitable? And the answer is not complex. But it is demanding. You eliminate unnecessary input. You define clear outputs. You repeat consistently. And you allow time to do what intensity cannot. Transform patterns into identity. At that point, you no longer need to think about discipline. because your system produces it automatically. And once that happens, your relationship with effort changes again. Effort is no longer resistance. It becomes direction. A controlled application of energy towards something that matters. Not scattered. Not reactive. But intentional. And that is where autonomy begins. Not in freedom from structure, but in control over it. Because the paradox is simple. The more structured your environment, the more freedom you experience internally. Less chaos outside. Less conflict inside. And when internal conflict decreases, action becomes clear. Not easy, but clear. And clarity removes hesitation. And without hesitation, execution improves. And when execution improves consistently, results follow. Not as a surprise, but as a consequence. And at that point, the process becomes self-reinforcing. You act, you see results, your belief updates, your actions stabilize. This is the loop you want. Not the loop of distraction and guilt, but the loop of action and confirmation. And everything begins with attention. Not as a concept, but as a practice. Something you manage daily. Something you protect deliberately. Because once you understand its value, you stop giving it away carelessly. And when you stop giving it away, you begin to accumulate something that most people lack. Mental capital. The ability to direct your mind towards something and stay there. Long enough to create something meaningful. Long enough to understand something deeply. Long enough to change. At this level, the discussion is no longer about habits. It is about authorship. Because once you understand how attention, environment, and repetition interact, you are forced to confront a simple question. Who is designing your life? If you are not doing it consciously, something else is doing it for you. Not in a dramatic way, but through small, repeated influences that accumulate over time. Every piece of content you consume shapes your perception. Every distraction you engage with weakens your ability to stay with what matters. Every incomplete action reinforces a pattern of avoidance. And these patterns do not stay isolated. They compound. This is the part most people underestimate. They think in isolated actions. One distraction. One missed task. One unproductive day. But the brain does not register life in isolated events. It registers patterns. And patterns define trajectories. A single action does not matter. A repeated action becomes identity. And identity determines future behavior with increasing precision. So when you say, "I can't focus," what you are actually describing is not a limitation. You are describing a pattern that has been reinforced. And what has been reinforced can be replaced. But not through intention. Through substitution. You do not remove a pattern. You overwrite it. By repeatedly exposing your system to a different sequence of actions under controlled conditions. This is where most people fail. They try to eliminate behavior without replacing it. They remove distraction, but they do not define what fills the space. An empty space does not remain empty. It gets filled automatically. Usually by the same pattern you were trying to remove. So the process must be precise. You reduce input. But you increase direction. You remove noise. But you define structure. You limit distraction. But you replace it with focused action. Otherwise, nothing stabilizes. Now, there is a deeper layer to this. Control is not just about what you do. It is about what you tolerate. If you tolerate constant interruption, you train your system to expect it. If you tolerate low-quality input, you normalize it. If you tolerate unfinished actions, you reinforce fragmentation. Tolerance defines baseline. And baseline defines behavior. This is why change requires raising your standard. Not in an abstract way, but in measurable terms. You decide what is acceptable for your attention, what is acceptable for your time, what is acceptable for your output. And once defined, you enforce it through environment, not willpower. Because willpower fluctuates. Environment stabilizes. This is a principle, not an opinion. Now consider the long-term implication. If you control your attention consistently over time, you create something most people never develop. Continuity. The ability to stay with a direction long enough for it to produce results. Most people do not fail because they lack ability. They fail because they change direction too often. Driven by distraction, novelty, or emotional fluctuation. Continuity removes that. It creates accumulation. And accumulation creates leverage. Not instantly, but inevitably. This is where effort becomes exponential. Because each focused action builds on the previous one, instead of being reset by distraction. And when that happens, your output changes. Your thinking becomes more structured. Your decisions become more accurate. Your execution becomes more efficient. Not because you became more intelligent, but because you reduced interference. Interference is the invisible cost most people never calculate. They measure effort. They measure time. But they ignore fragmentation. And fragmentation destroys output. Even small interruptions reduce cognitive depth. They break mental context. They force your brain to restart processes repeatedly, which increases fatigue without increasing results. So removing interference is not optional. It is foundational. Now, at the highest level, this leads to a shift in how you define progress. Progress is no longer emotional. It is operational. You are not asking, "Do I feel motivated?" You are asking, "Is the system working?" And if the system is working, results will follow. Because systems do not depend on mood. They depend on structure. This removes a large part of internal conflict. You are no longer negotiating with yourself constantly. You execute. You observe. You adjust. This is how stability is built. Not through inspiration, but through iteration. And iteration requires one condition above all. You stay engaged long enough to see feedback. Which brings us back to attention. Without attention, there is no feedback. Without feedback, there is no correction. Without correction, there is no improvement. So attention is not just the starting point. It is the entire process. It determines input, processing, and output. And when managed correctly, it creates a closed loop of continuous improvement. Now, the final point. There is no neutral state. You are either training your attention or losing it. Every day, every interaction, every decision. There is no pause. Only direction. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Because direction, maintained over time, defines outcome. And outcome, repeated, defines identity. So if you want to change your life in a meaningful way, you do not start with ambition. You start with attention. You protect it. You direct it. You sustain it. And you allow time to compound it. Everything else follows from that. Not immediately, but predictably. And predictability is what gives you control. Not control over everything, but control over the process. And control over the process is enough. Because if the process is correct, the result is not a matter of chance. It is a matter of time. You don't need more motivation. You need control over your attention. Because the quality of your attention determines the quality of your life.